Welcome to this virtual memorial for Louis Kampf. My name is Arthur McEwen. I was a friend of Louis. That doesn't say very much to identify me because Louis had very many friends. Those of you who are attending this event and many more. It of course tells us something about Louis that he had so many friends. His multitude of friends were very important to him. But perhaps I can identify myself a little more by saying that as a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts in Boston for many years, I like to think of myself as one of Louis's go-to guys for economic issues. In this memorial, you will hear from several of Louis's long-term friends from different parts of his life. I will introduce them as we go along. Also, we will have some music, an interlude among the presentations from Franz Schubert, and at the end, another Coltrane, His Body and Soul. Also, after the presentations, Gene Jackson, Louis's partner for over 30 years, will have a few words to say. Regarding Gene, I want to recognize all the work she did in bringing together this memorial event. It's plenty of work to put together a memorial during normal times. To put together a virtual memorial, however, is a lot more work, let me tell you. So many thanks to Gene for bringing us this event. I met Louis through our shared political activity. One of the things that always stood out to me about him was his commitment to left-wing politics. I learned a lot about this commitment by reading the interviews that we have posted on the Memories website, memories.com. And I would urge you to read it too when you have a chance. You will, as I did, probably learn a great deal more about Louis than you already know. In order to get us started, I want to read a bit from one of those interviews. Louis, in the interviews, was asked the question, what were the beginnings of your political commitment in Washington Heights? Louis responded, he said, if I had to choose a particular incident, it would be something that happened to me when I was about 14 years old. My mother sent me to the delicatessen to get something. The delicatessen was on Broadway between 162nd and 163rd. I walked in and there was a black man there. Of course, the word was colored at that particular time. And he had bought something and he told the clerk that he had been shortchanged a nickel. The clerk insisted no such thing had happened. And the black man said, look, I need that nickel. It's important to me. I'm poor. Whereupon the guy said, okay, you can have your nickel. At that moment, two cops came storming in with brass knuckles on their hands. And they just beat this guy into a living pulp. I mean, there was blood all over the floor. They then dragged him out, bounced him up and down on the floor as they were dragging him, and his face had disappeared. It simply wasn't there anymore. And I stood there wondering, isn't somebody going to say something about this? Isn't somebody going to say, stop, this is bad? Well, nobody did. And I couldn't believe it. I went home and I told my parents, and they simply shrugged their shoulders. I guess maybe they assumed I made it up. Since things like this don't happen in America, they only happen on the other side. And at that moment, at that point, I started to ask some questions about what the situation of Blacks was in the United States. I started reading the newspapers, the PM, which carried a lot of articles by I.F. Stone. And I started educating myself politically. Commitment to to progressive politics, to left-wing politics, was an important part of Louis's life. But it was only a part. By no means the only important part. The friends you will hear from today will provide a more complete picture. The first among these friends is Marjorie Bakken. Marjorie is the president emerita of Wheelock College. For 25 years, she, along with her husband Harold and their daughter Martha, lived with Louis and others in the house at 1214 Glenwood Avenue in Cambridge. Louis and Marjorie shared a deep friendship for 50 years. She will read Louis's letter to his friends, written shortly before he died. Marjorie?
Thanks, Arthur. And now I'm going to read the letter. May 2020, to my dear friends, you know who you are. My abject apologies for the disorderly mess I left for you to take care of. Rarely having been known for my tact, further apologies for any feelings I might have hurt during our intense dives into the dialectic. I have tried to live a personally and politically decent life, not always with success. The positive things I've accomplished came about through the wise guidance of my friends, as well as the challenges posed by my students. The follies and dishonesties emerged from my neurotic needs. I've been so lucky to be the recipient of the spiritual strength you, dear friends, bestowed on me. Enough, lest we drown in a swamp of sentimentality. Be good to yourself. Have fun. Kick ass. Given my current circumstances, my only hesitation I feel about dying is leaving you wonderful people. Louis. Louis lived in a house on Glenwood Avenue for 50 years, called the Faculty House by the neighbors. The house came to have a mystique of its own, and it became the symbol of the durable and affectionate ties among the people who lived there. Louis was the central, most significant person for us in the house and for the neighbors. Lots of conversations in the house were domestic, just ordinary talk. I'm going to start cleaning the basement on Saturday. Who can help me do that? Jim Driscoll is coming tomorrow to fix outlets on the first floor. Anybody home? Turns out that Louis and Jim became very fast friends. I need a ride to the airport, Harvard Square, MIT at 3 p.m. Is anybody available? There was no email, no texting, no cell phones. We all schlepped up and down the stairs to communicate, to share our lives. There was fun and joy. Elaborate birthday celebrations, particularly for Phyllis, Ellen, and Harold, who had December birthdays, days apart. In those celebrations, Louis was the chef, I was the helper. Festive homecomings for people who had been away. Celebrations for completion of a dissertation, a book, an article. Visits from parents, family members, friends. There were agreed upon tasks. Caretaking of 2 babies, soon little girls. Shoveling snow, hauling garbage. Care of the swimming pool, including when it sprang a giant leak and flooded the neighborhood. There were political activities, neighborhood sister city projects, marches through the local Stop and Shop to protest the Vietnam War, as well as participation in local and national protests. There was sadness, the death of a parent, a separation, a divorce, people leaving the house. Louis was always the energetic keeper of the friendships, cherishing us and our children in ways that allowed us to cherish each other. I have had for many months a sticker on my Kindle given to me by Maggie, my granddaughter. It has become my daily message from Louis. Wake up, kick ass, be kind, repeat. To live on in the memory of others means that you do not die. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. Our next presenter is Paul Lauder. Paul is the Alan Kay and Gwendolyn Miles Smith Professor of Literature Emeritus at Trinity College. He and Louis, in 1972, published The Politics of Literature. Paul has just published a new book, Our 60s, which he says is essentially about his life as an activist and educator in the 1960s and 1970s. Paul?
I'm one of those who can say Louis was my dear friend. It's one measure of him that there are, as author said, literally dozens of us who might say the same thing. Some years ago, when I had been operated on for lung cancer, Louis called me every day, literally every day, for more than a month to make sure that I was okay. He was, likewise, there for many others in sickness and in health. Being there entailed a good deal more than, hello, how are you? He always engaged what was or should have been on your mind, and certainly his. Israel, Palestine, the exploitation of adjuncts, and what the MLA or radical teacher could or could not do about it. What anyway did we mean by publishing a magazine on radical teaching? For most of his 91 years, he was engaged with these and the other political worries about which he was occasionally known to fret. We worked closely together, even at a distance, since I was always in and around Baltimore or Washington or New York or someplace, and he was always up in Cambridge. And we even performed that ultimately intimate ritual, writing together. In fact, however, we often deeply disagreed, and about nothing so much as his decision to pack it in. It was a conclusion which troubled me in ways that has been hard to fathom, and about which I thought every day when we talked, as we did when he was in the hospital and hospice, and as I described walking about with my catheter. But I could never bring myself to question his decision. It was, after all, his to make. Or was it? I'm pretty sure we could have argued at Talmudic length over that question. I might have said, you have socialized your life, but now you privatize your death. But I didn't. I was intimidated. And so I came to silence. Rescued from that silence in the echoing halls of poetry. In this case, by Edna St. Vincent Millay's Dirge Without Music, which I will now read. I am not resigned to the shutting away of loving hearts in the hard ground. So it is, and so it will be, for so it has been, time out of mind. Into the darkness they go, the wise and the lovely, crowned with lilies and with laurel they go, but I am not resigned. Lovers and thinkers, into the earth with you. Be one with the dull, the indiscriminate dust. A fragment of what you felt, of what you knew, a formula, a phrase remains. But the best is lost. The answers, quick and keen, the honest look, the laughter, the love, they are gone. They are gone to feed the roses. Elegant and curled is the blossom. Fragrant is the blossom. I know, but I do not approve. More precious was the light in your eyes than all the roses in the world. Down, down, down into the darkness of the grave. Gently they go. The beautiful, the tender, the kind. Quietly they go. The intelligent, the witty, the brave. I know, but I do not approve, and I am not resigned. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, both for your words and for your reading. The next speaker is Martha Vicinis. Martha Vicinis taught for many years at the University of Michigan, where she was the Eliza M. Mosher Distinguished University Professor of English, Women's Studies, and History. She first met Louis at the infamous 1968 Modern Language Association meeting. Martha says she learned from Louis, and I quote, to look critically at our profession and to read beyond the Anglo-American literary tradition. And I quote again, most of all, Louis encouraged me to challenge and love my students and myself. Martha?
All of us know that Louis was a brilliant friend, both intellectually and emotionally. However great his intellectual prowess, he poured himself into being the kind of friend he wanted us to be. And I think we tried hard to meet his expectations. We all experienced his gentle criticism and his absolute loyalty. I am grateful that before he died, I was able to tell Louis that he has always been my best and most faithful friend over 50 years. He was unfailingly kind, supportive, and honest when I needed it. And I have two very disparate anecdotes here. One is how many times he read the manuscripts that we sent him, how many times he then asked for a copy of our book and then read the book, and yet always offering criticism that was somehow so palatable, so acute. Yet at my most difficult point, he immediately came to Ann Arbor, knowing that listening can be healing. For me, as for many of us, he is irreplaceable. Today, we meet as a small number of the many friends who love and remember Louis's impact on our lives. Many of us are at the age where we've lost dear friends. People we have relied on for decades are now gone. Louis lived a long and fulfilling life, and yet I'm still learning how to reconcile myself to life without him. We've come together to celebrate Louis's life and to share our grief, for we must now live without his comforting presence. I am very happy that I decided to retire here because I had 12 years of being in his neighborhood and many, many lunches in Harvard Square with him. I think these memories are really what helps us in this period of grief. I have chosen Elizabeth Bishop's poem, One Art, which suggests that the loss of someone we love is simply and painfully part of the many losses that plague us daily. Yet in the end, Bishop makes an ironic turn and writes that, after all, there is only the irreplaceable loss of someone we have loved. Louis, the displaced Austrian Jew who battled so hard to make his native country better, his adopted country better, always understood that irony was the best defense against loss. One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent, The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names, and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture of love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing isn't too hard to master. Though it may look like, write it like disaster.
Thank you very much, Martha. Our next presentation is by Dick Oman. Dick Oman is the Benjamin Waite Professor of the English Language Emeritus at Wesleyan University. He and Louis met when Louis arrived at Harvard in 1958, and they spent 3 years together as junior fellows and many more years together on various activities, including the Radical Teacher. Dick?
Louis and I talked from time to time about death. His feelings and intentions were clearer than mine. A few years ago, I asked him if he had an idea how he would die. Suicide, he said without hesitation. I was surprised, but now understand what he meant. Setting standards for the quality of life he would accept and choosing the time and manner of his leaving it. I admire that, though the loss hurts. He said to me several times he hoped he would die before I did. I know he said the same thing to others as an expression of gratitude and friendship, I believe. How did he expect us to get on without him? I bet he expected me to write a poem. I thought of Emily Dickinson's, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. With Louis, it was just the opposite. Here he is, accosting death in the voice of Emily Dickinson. Because death would not stop for me, I spoke to him. Please give not glory or eternity, but simply not to live with bodily decrepitude, short breath and failing heart, nor in brain-addled geezerhood where sense and syntax part. Mr. Death, I'll ride with you, drive past the setting sun. Take me on where I can view coldly oblivion. Thank you.
Thanks, Dick. Thank you very much. The pictures you will see on the screen are photos that Jean Jackson took on Cape Cod, where she and Louis vacationed every summer. The next presentation is by Phyllis Ewan. Phyllis Ewan is an artist. And I should note, Louis had three of her pieces hanging in his apartment. She was a longtime friend and Cambridge neighbor of Louis. Phyllis and her husband, Jim Campen, enjoyed spending loving times with Louis and Jean over many years and now continue this relationship with Jean. Phyllis?
Thank you, Arthur. I met Louis when I was 25 in 1967, so we were friends for most of my life. As with all good friends, he was just there, just here. So I keep expecting to run into him as I walk or hear his voice when I pick up the phone. I miss, as other people have talked about, his loving concern, his impish smile, his occasionally caustic wit, and his keen intelligence. But mostly I just miss his everyday presence in my life. As many of you know, when in conversation, he might insert a quote from literature, a reference to history, politics, or a song, or comment on a sports figure. But every once in a while, Louis surprised me with a reference to a poem that illuminated something I've been thinking about. I read a lot, but poetry is not my habit. But Louis did read poetry, and he knew it intimately. Here's one occasion. Between 1995 and 2005, I fabricated installations out of indoor-outdoor carpet, the inexpensive version of AstroTurf used in the city in working class neighborhoods to simulate lawns. These outrageous plants and hinges I placed into the natural environment as a comment. False ferns, quaking bog, lawn chairs were some of the individual pieces. Louis gave me the title for the entire series, Green Thoughts. This came from a line in a poem by 17th century poet Andrew Marvell. Not a grief poem, but a life poem, The Garden. Because the poem introduced me to another side of Louis, I will read some of the stanzas. The Garden by Andrew Marvell. Fair quiet, I have found thee here, and innocence, thy sister dear. Mistaken long, I sought you then in busy company of men. Your sacred plants, if here below, only among the plants will grow. Society is all but rude to this delicious solitude. No white nor red was ever seen, so amorous as this lovely green. Fond lovers, cruel as their flame, cut in these trees their mistress' name. Little, alas, they know or heed how far these beauties hers exceed. Fair trees, where'er your barks I wound, no name shall but your own be found. What wondrous life in this I lead. Ripe apples drop about my head. The luscious clusters of the vine upon my mouth do crush their wine. The nectarine and curious peach into my hands themselves do reach, stumbling on melons as I pass, and snared with flowers, I fall on grass. Meanwhile, the mind, from pleasureless, withdraws into its happiness. The mind, that ocean where each kind does straight to its own resemblance find, yet it creates, transcending these, far other worlds and other seas, annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade. Here at the fountain's sliding foot, or at some fruit tree's mossy root, casting the body's vest aside, my soul into the boughs doth glide. There like a bird it sits and sings, then whets and combs its silver wings, until prepared for longer flight, waves its plumes, the various light. The poet argues for a life of quiet, contemplation against living actively in society. So it seems that Louis Kampf, urbanite and activist, also needed and loved some quiet solitude where his thoughts could grow and expand. A green thought in a green shade. Thank you, Louis.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. The next speaker, the next presentation is Saul Slapikoff. Saul is retired from Tufts University, where he taught both biology and American studies. He and Louis developed their friendship in the anti-war and draft resistance movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s. They were close friends ever since and close neighbors in recent decades. Saul?
Louis was above all a great friend. We met in 1967 with the coming, let me start over. Louis was above all a great friend. We met in 1967 with me coming out of a 10-year hiatus from political activity. At the time we met because I was invited to attend the board meeting of Resist, a nationwide organization committed to resisting the draft. Resist was anxious to recruit people like me and Hilda Hine to become knowledgeable and to work with Boston area draft resistance groups. Louis was the person on the board who oversaw Hilda Hines and my work with the draft resistance movement. Louis and I got to know each other in this political context. It was also the hope of the Resist Board that Hilda and I would work and keep the local draft resistance groups off the back of the national office, which was housed in Central Square, Cambridge. It was also the home of the Resist Board that Hilda and I sorry about that. My friendship with Louis was strengthened by our daily morning phone calls. During these things, among others, we talked about articles in the Boston Globe, New York Times. While I read the Globe, he read both, and would inform me of issues not covered in both papers. We would compare how each paper focused on a major topic, like the Israeli occupation of Palestine, for example, or we exchanged our responses about human interest stories. Louis always began reading the newspaper by reading the obituary and sports sections in the newspapers. In the obituary columns, he would look to how people had lived their lives. What could he learn from others' lives experiences? Reading sports reflected his engagement with sports, first as a player at Long Island University on their basketball team, which was a leading basketball power. And then later he taught sport at MIT, where he taught a course on sports in America. For him, sport both distracted people from major life problems and also reflected major political and cultural events in the contemporary world. For years, our morning calls began very early in the morning, soon after 6, because each of us was living alone and we were early risers. Later, when I began my relationship with Flora and he with Jean, we spoke closer to 8 when Flora was up and having breakfast. Often Louis would end up having a short conversation with Flora, particularly to inform her of Latin American cultural events reported in the New York Times. For much of his lifetime, Louis was passionate about the arts, from grand opera to early music to jazz and country, everything in between. Louis also devoured art museums, dance, theater, and film. During the 1980s, there were many more jazz venues than there are currently in the Boston area. We go to hear jazz 3 or 4 nights a week. We befriended the pianist James Williams, and on occasion went out to lunch with him. Louis often engaged musicians in conversation between sets or after. On a less serious question, Louis was quite sensitive to his own self-presentation. While in hot summer weather, Louis would proudly sport shorts and a t-shirt with an explicit political message. He often wore the Radical Teacher t-shirt, for example. As soon as the weather got a bit cooler in autumn, Louis' self-presentation changed markedly. He might wear slacks and a sport jacket, and occasionally even a shirt and tie. Louis was fortunate in having a friend, George Siegel, whose family manufactured menswear and who supplied Louis with clothes produced in his family's businesses. In wintertime, Louis favored corduroys with a tweed jacket and leather elbow patches. At his 50th birthday party, Ellen, his first wife, bought Louis some bold, deeply colored shirts. When Louis saw them, he inadvertently blanched and expressed doubt as to ever wearing them because they were too bold. My recollection is a little hazy, but I think Louis actually wore them on a few occasions. In his long relationship with Jean, Louis benefited from Jean keeping an eye out for sales and encouraging Louis to be a little less conservative in his choice of clothes. Ultimately, he dressed like a consummate college professor. I miss Louis. I'll keep him close to my heart always.
Thank you very much, Saul. Our next presentation is by Ruth Perry. Ruth Perry is the Ann Feder Friedlander Professor of Humanities at MIT. She was the first woman at MIT to be tenured in the literature department from within the ranks rather than being brought in with tenure from outside. She started the Women's Studies program at MIT in 1984, and Louis started teaching in that program a few years later. She was a colleague of Louis for many years and organized a symposium in his honor when he retired in 1996. Ruth?
Thank you. I first met Louis when I came to interview at MIT in 1971. The department into which I came was very different from what it turned into. And only recently have I realized that the marvelous cohort of 18 junior faculty members was a legacy from Louis' chairmanship of that department. They were a radically committed and deeply intellectual group. Jack McNeese, Lillian Robinson, Alan Berger, Peter Herman, Susan Gerard, and many others. At the very first meeting I attended, someone pointed out that since I was the person in the room with the youngest child, I ought to have the first choice of teaching times. I seriously thought I had died and gone to heaven. This was feminism in action. Most of those radical junior faculty members were against the war in Vietnam. They met regularly with others from the humanities department at MIT to plan and run anti-war demonstrations. One old friend, remembering those days, told me about Louis' remark one afternoon when a few of them were folding flyers for an anti-war event. Seeing a cigar in my friend's shirt pocket, Louis told an anecdote about Big Bill Hayward, the early labor leader, released from jail in Chicago after the 1919 assault on unions. At the press conference following Hayward's release, a reporter tried to provoke him by asking how he could justify smoking a Cuban cigar that cost $1. But Big Bill took a puff and said, "Gentlemen, nothing's too good for the working class." In time, all those vibrant young people left or were not renewed by the by then conventional leadership of the department because they were not going to write their theses or publish enough in the right places or otherwise fit the successful academic profile. Only 2 of us out of that original group were left standing in the end. And certainly during my own trials and tribulations, I always felt Louis supported me. He wrote a short story for the Radical Teacher about the departmental meeting on my tenure case, with barely disguised descriptions of the senior faculty and their fatuous remarks. In the story, he represents himself as a resigned onlooker rather than an active fighter. Louis had been a student of the Enlightenment, which was my field as well, and very soon after I was hired, he invited me to peruse the bookshelves in his office and take any of the 18th century books that interested me. I very happily made off with an 8-volume set of Lecky's History of England, to which I have had recourse ever since. Although he never disparaged me for continuing to work in the field, he once explained to me that he was not going to work on poets that would never have given him the time of day because of his class and being Jewish. Alexander Pope would never have tolerated him at dinner. And he felt that the authors of the period were ideologically complicit in the kind of imperialism and jingoistic nationalism he detested. In 1968, Louis was one of 130 MIT faculty members who signed an open letter to MIT's president, Howard Johnson, urging him to end MIT's relationship with the Department of Defense. Noam Chomsky also signed that letter, and the 2 of them taught a joint seminar for the next 4 years on the subject of American imperialism, and that seminar had a huge enrollment. MIT had its share of demonstrations in 1969, marches, sit-ins, classroom disruptions, everyone trying to put pressure on the institution to renounce the funding of the Defense Department. MIT was at that time one of the top 10 universities receiving funding for military-related research. And not until 1973, following a heated faculty meeting, did MIT effect a financial separation from Lincoln Laboratories, which was where such research continued. But early in 1969, some students, abetted by some faculty, used a battering ram to break into the office of President Johnson and occupy it for 34 hours, after which negotiations failed and the administration called in the police. Louis did not incite or conspire with the students, but he certainly supported them, joining the sit-in and supplying them with food. Johnson was unforgiving. Louis lost his chairmanship and they froze his salary. In the records of the university, there are letters from Wayne O'Neill, who followed Louis as chair of literature, accusing the administration of discriminating against Louis on political grounds, and a memo in those files about keeping a professor who was being courted by Brandeis because he was a stabilizing and moderating force to balance Louis' leftist leanings. He talked New York, but he wrote with a European handwriting, and he had an unusual mixture of laid-back insouciance with the knowingness of the conoscenti. In our literature meetings, he didn't say much, but tended to come in whenever there was an impasse to say something sardonic or cynical, which sometimes broke that logjam of hardening positions. He taught subjects in American literature and culture, contemporary literature, and world literature. And he could quote most sources in its original language. The topics of Louis' subjects, like the famous sequence he taught called American Voices, ranged widely. Instead of traditional categories like fiction, drama, or poetry, he organized it around categories like ballads from Goethe to Willie Nelson or songs by working class women. Louis was the first male professor in the fledgling Women's Studies program in 1984, and for a while the only male professor. His support for the program was very important. And the sports course that Saul mentioned was taught in our Women's Studies program. He taught subjects in women's literature and in practical feminism, in which the students went into the community and wrote up their experiences. They worked in such organizations as Rosie's Place, a women's shelter, or the Our Bodies Ourselves storefront health information clinic. Our MIT students tended to be extremely useful to these organizations and would overhaul their computer systems and give other kinds of technical support. Indeed, it was an immensely valuable subject, and we've been talking lately about reviving it, both to honor Louis and to do some good in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Our next presentation is a joint presentation by Irene Genzer and Asaf Kfouri. Irene, like Louis, was from a European refugee family, and she grew up in the same Washington Heights milieu. But Irene was about 10 years behind Louis, and it was later in Cambridge that, as she notes, and I quote, Louis became part of the landscape of my life. Irene is now retired from Boston University's Political Science Department. Asaf, who is a professor in BU's Computer Science Department, has been both Louis's friend and Louis's consultant on things related to mathematics and theoretical computer science. Who knew Louis was interested in theoretical computer science? Irene and Asaf.
Louis was, I think of him as being permanently present in my life, although in fact we met many, many years ago. I did not know him in Washington Heights, but we did talk about that common past, common European refugees, not with any particular nostalgia, but simply recognition of that, the way it was. But Louis was a witness in the transformations of my life and was unconditionally loyal, curious, always asking about what I was working on, even though it was far removed, or so I thought, from his own interests. This continued until very, very recently, and his interest also extended to our family. Asaf will talk about that. I'm thinking now about our son Alex and grandchildren and so on. So for me, Louis is, as they say, presente. Thank you.
Thank you, Art, for saying that I was Louis consultant in mathematics and computer science. Well, the fact is, at one point, well, first of all, whenever something related to mathematics and computer science came up, he would call Irene. I don't like to talk on the phone. I have some kind of a phobia about that. And he would say, I want to talk to Asaf. And then he would say something like maybe an obit about a mathematician or some result in mathematics, and he would ask my opinion on it. And I was always impressed, because whenever it has to do with culture, music, jazz, American writers, of course, I would turn to him. And he had something to say. And something that, this is my own little secret, I even have a paper in mathematics, believe it or not, that once I was explaining what it was, and he said, I would like to read it. Are you sure, Louis, you'll be able to read that? So I just give it to me. And I gave him a paper, mathematics. He read the introduction, he read the first part, the conclusion, and came back with comments telling me this is not very clear, this is clear, you can do it better, and so on. Well, okay, so here you have a sense, it's not only the politics that put us together, but also a way of interacting, whatever the person is, okay? So, and coming and really trying to help out. One thing that I would like, something that came to mind before, I was going to say more on that, but when I saw that Art planned to put Schubert, the Opus 100 on in the middle, I thought one day, that's many years ago, I'd like to show off too, that, you know, okay, on anything related to culture, Louis will be there and he'll have a lot to say to me. So I thought maybe I would try to impress him. That morning, that many years ago, I heard on the radio the Schubert 100, Opus 100. And in the afternoon, I happened to have also the same CD at home. So the next weekend when we saw him, I told Louis, look, I have here a CD I'd like you to hear. It is by the Bose Trio. What is that? It's the Bose Trio, B-O-S-E Trio. And I put it on. And then, what do you think? And then he said, this is the Beaux-Arts Trio. I thought probably he would be fooled the way I was fooled myself in the morning when I was listening this to the radio. The announcer on WCRB started by saying, now we're going to put a trio by Schubert, the 100, Opus 100. It's by the Bose Trio. And I was totally puzzled. I listened, it was very beautiful. And at the end, he kept repeating, this is the Bose Trio. And finally, before turning off, he said, that was the Bose Arts Trio. And then I thought probably Louis would be fooled the same way. Well, he wasn't fooled by it. Immediately he recognized it was the Beaux-Arts Trio. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Asaf and Irene. Also, let me thank all of the presenters. It's been very moving and very interesting, and I appreciated what everyone had to say. I would like now to turn things over to Jean Jackson to say a few final words. Jean?
Well, first of all, thanks so much to all of you watching this memorial event. We very much appreciated the opportunity to put this on. Thanks also to the presenters. All of us are dear friends of Louis. We miss him terribly. We think that he would have enjoyed this a great deal, although he did not like compliments, so some of it he would have been embarrassed by. Finally, I want to thank Dawn Morden and her team at MIT Video Productions. Without your help, we could not have done this. Thank you very much.